Truth behind the fall of Troy. A warm Aegean wind moves across a coastline that no longer remembers its own name. The sea glows like hammered bronze, the cliffs breathe with the weight of forgotten centuries, and somewhere beneath layers of dust and silence lie the bones of a city that once believed the gods themselves guarded its walls. This was Troy, proud, fortified, and shining like a crown above the strait of the Dardanelles. Before its towers collapsed into ash, Troy stood as a gate between worlds. Merchant ships from Crete, Cyprus, and the Black Sea coast gathered in its harbors. Bronze armor clattered in its courtyards. Its kings ruled with confidence born from wealth, geography, and myth. To the people who walked its stone roads, Troy felt immovable, an inheritance blessed by destiny, too important and too favored to fall. Yet beneath its polished surface, cracks were forming. Whispers of omens drifted through the palace halls. Dreams unsettled the priests. And in the quiet corners of the city, fear took root. Fear that pride had reached too far, that alliances were loosening, and that the horizon carried more than just the sails of ordinary visitors. History remembers the fall of Troy through layers of legend. A stolen queen, a decade of war, a wooden horse. But the true collapse began long before the final night. It began with choices, human choices, born from ambition, ego, and the fragile boundary between belief and reality. As the moon rose over the Aegean on Troy's last night, the city that once defied time met the limits of its own certainty. And when the flames climbed its towers, it was not only stone that burned, but the belief that any empire, no matter how blessed, stands forever. Chapter 1. A Kingdom Born from Prophecy. Before empires carved borders into the earth, before sailors mapped the restless Aegean, the land that would one day cradle Troy was nothing more than a quiet rise of stone and wind. Travelers passed it without pause. Shepherds climbed it without reverence. Yet in the tremble of its grass and the trembling light of dawn, something waited, something that would shift the story of an entire world. In that ancient age, when kings traced their bloodlines to gods, and every shadow seemed to hold divine intent, a young leader named Ilus searched for the sign that would mark his destiny. He carried with him a belief older than his footsteps, that heaven itself chose where great cities would rise. Myth tells us he wandered far from his ancestral home, crossing river valleys and lonely plains, guided only by the echo of a prophecy whispered to his family for generations. He sought a place where fate would make itself known. One night, as the sky burned with the last embers of sunset, Ilus climbed a hill overlooking the quiet passage between the Aegean and the Black Sea. The wind grew still, as if caught in a moment of anticipation. And there, descending from the heavens like a falling star, came the sacred omen. Ancient storytellers described it as a radiant sign, a divine token sent from Zeus himself. Some said it glowed like white fire. Others believed it shimmered like newly polished bronze. In truth, what descended that night mattered less than what it meant. Ilus had found the place the gods had chosen. The hill transformed in that instant. No longer a lonely rise in the landscape, it became a promise. Ilus marked the ground, claimed it, and vowed that a city built upon this sacred gift would stand as a beacon to every shore the Aegean touched. Stone by stone, his followers shaped the first outlines of what would become Troy. Strong walls rising toward the sky, watchtowers gripping the ridge, and wide gates opening to the world's trade routes. The city seemed to emerge like a revelation, its foundations kissed by the prophecy that birthed it. Merchants soon arrived, their sails appearing like pale wings across the water. With them came bronze, spices, dyed cloth, and stories carried from distant islands. Troy grew not through conquest, but through its position at a crossroads where cultures met. Its wealth rose quickly, and with it, the pride of its people. To them, the city's success proved what the omen had announced. The gods favored Troy. But in the shadow of that certainty lived a quieter, older fear. The earliest chronicles of the city, fragments of tablets, shards of oral tradition, suggest that Troy's priests carried their own interpretation of the prophecy. While Ilus saw blessing, they saw warning. They believed that anything granted suddenly by divine will could be taken away just as swiftly. A city founded on a gift from the sky might one day return its glory to that same sky in smoke and fire. To the priests, destiny was a circle, not a line. Their whispers travelled through the palace, drifting like cold wind across the thresholds. They reminded Troy's first rulers that quick prosperity often shadows deeper risks. But the city grew faster than caution could contain. Towers rose higher, walls thickened. The people looked out from their fortified heights with the confidence of those who believed themselves chosen. The prophecies darker half faded from memory, buried beneath the sound of markets and the glitter of new wealth. Yet destiny does not disappear when ignored. It waits. As Troy entered its first generation of kings, subtle signs began to trouble the priests. Strange storms appeared along the coast. Birds circled the palace at dusk in restless patterns. Dreams unsettled the royal household, filled with images of broken gates and burning streets. These visions were dismissed as superstition, the natural fears of a young civilization. But to the keepers of tradition, they were reminders of a truth too easily forgotten. A kingdom born from heaven might one day be reclaimed by it. Still, Troy flourished. Its soldiers trained under the shadow of the citadel, its harbour filled with ships carrying goods from Mycenae, Cyprus, and beyond. Bronze helmets lined the armory. Chariots rolled through the courtyard, polished by the sun. The city's fame grew across the Aegean, reaching the shores of Greece and the rugged lands of Anatolia. And with fame came attention, admiration from allies, envy from rivals. Ilus himself grew old watching his city rise beyond anything he had imagined on the night the omen descended. He saw the walls stretch wider, the towers reach higher, the streets fill with voices and footsteps. Yet even in his final years, he remained uneasy. Some sources claim he returned often to the hill where the divine sign first touched the earth, standing alone at dusk, staring toward horizons that held both promise and warning. Perhaps he sensed the truth his descendants would ignore, that the same winds carrying prosperity across Troy's ramparts could one day carry destruction. When Ilus died, Troy did not mourn a lost king. It mourned a founder whose memory seemed woven into the stones themselves. And yet his passing marked the beginning of a subtle shift. The prophecy that shaped the city's birth drifted further into myth. The priest's warnings grew softer, overshadowed by the confidence of new rulers who sought expansion, wealth, and alliances rather than humble obedience to destiny. Generations later, poets would claim that Troy's fate was sealed in that first moment of divine blessing, not because the gods hated the city, but because a kingdom born at the edge of heaven always stands closer to the edges of ruin. What rises too quickly rises into danger. And so Troy continued to grow, brilliant, powerful, unaware that the roots of its future tragedy were already buried beneath its foundations. In the quiet hours of night, as the Aegean winds moved through the citadel's columns, some claimed they could still feel the echo of the omen, the breath of a destiny that watched patiently from above. A reminder that every miracle carries a cost, and that every city touched by the divine walks a thin line between glory and downfall. For Troy, that line had already been drawn in the sky long before the first stone was laid. Chapter 2. The House of Priam Ascends. Before the storm gathered, before the gates thundered beneath foreign spears, Troy entered what many believed would be its most radiant age. Centuries had passed since Ilus first raised its walls, and the city no longer looked like the fragile dream of a wandering founder. It stood now as a marvel of the Aegean world, broad avenues paved with stone, ramparts that caught the morning sun like polished bronze, and a palace whose terraces overlooked the restless strait where countless ships passed in tribute. It was into this world of rising glory that Priam ascended the throne. His rise did not come quietly. Troy in those days was a tapestry stitched from rival clans, noble families whose loyalties flowed more toward their own lineage than to the crown. The city's wealth had brought power, and power had brought ambition. Kings before Priam had walked a narrow path, balancing prosperity against the fragile peace of those who competed for influence within the palace halls. But when Priam took the scepter, something shifted. He carried with him a presence that steadied the room, calm, deliberate, and sharpened by an early life marked with loss and violence. Legends say that Priam once survived capture, ransom, and war long before he ever ruled. Whether these tales hold truth or poetic embellishment, they shaped how the people saw him. A king forged by hardship, not born into ease. Under his leadership, Troy began to align itself like constellations finding their order in the night sky. He united competing clans not through fear, but through promises of shared wealth and shared destiny. Trade caravans crossed Anatolia under Troy's protection. Merchant ships filled the harbors, carrying tin, copper, grain, wool, carved ivory, and wines fragrant with the scent of distant vineyards. The city became not only a fortress, but a crossroads of cultures: Greek, Hittite, Cretan, Thracian. Every marketplace echoed with languages from across the sea. And as the city grew stronger, Priam's reputation grew with it. His palace became the heartbeat of a thriving empire. Courtiers from foreign kingdoms dined beneath its oil-lit arches. Envoys from Mycenae and Sparta walked its polished floors, offering treaties and trade agreements. The people of Troy spoke his name with reverence, convinced that Priam had restored the sacred protection first promised to Ilus. Some even believed that the gods favored him. Others whispered that his wisdom outshone theirs. Yet beneath the applause, a quieter truth stirred. Prosperity does not erase old wounds, it only hides them. Within the house of Priam, the sprawling royal lineage that filled the palace chambers, old rivalries simmered beneath polite conversation. Brothers competed for influence. Aunts and uncles revived grudges buried for generations. Some noble families resented the king's growing power, fearing that his unification of Troy's clans would eventually diminish their own authority. And within Priam's own bloodline, shadows gathered in corners where even the sunlight struggled to reach. The king had many children, princes trained in arms, daughters trained in diplomacy, and others whose fates the poets would later immortalize. The household was large, diverse, and unpredictable, and with each new birth, the future of the throne grew more complicated. Lines of succession blurred, jealousies sharpened. The palace, though golden, became a maze of silent expectations and unspoken rivalry. Through these corridors walked the prophetess Cassandra, Priam's daughter, whose visions flickered like embers in an unseen wind. Ancient texts speak of her warnings, strange dreams, fractured glimpses of a future shadowed by fire. The priests tried to interpret what she saw, but her words unsettled them. They sensed echoes of the old prophecy, the one whispered during Ilis's time, that a kingdom blessed too greatly would one day be struck down with equal force. But Priam, who had spent years fighting real threats, raiders, rival tribes, and shifting alliances, could not bring himself to fear something as intangible as prophecy. His reign was steady. His alliances were strong. His people were prosperous. What danger could the winds possibly be carrying? Still, there were moments, small, fleeting, when even he felt a tremor of unease. A falcon falling, dead at the palace gate. Smoke rising from the northern hills after a lightning storm. A sudden quarrel between two of his sons that left a scar across the marble floor. These events seemed trivial, unrelated. Yet to those who watched closely, priests, seers, and the uneasy members of his council, these were signs, not of immediate destruction, but of fractures deepening quietly beneath the surface. For the more Troy prospered, the more its confidence swelled. And confidence, when left unchecked, slowly reshapes itself into something sharper: hubris. The house of Priam began to glow with the brilliance of a kingdom convinced of its own invincibility. Banquets lasted long into the night. Gold adorned the wrists of warriors and the necks of nobles. The throne room echoed with music, laughter, and the rustle of fabrics dyed with expensive pigments imported from lands far beyond the Aegean. But beneath the splendor, the divisions remained, small but persistent. Some princes aligned themselves with powerful clans, seeking to strengthen their future claims. Others drifted into the shadows, feeling overshadowed by their more favored siblings. Alliances formed behind closed doors. Resentments grew in silence. Even the loyalty of certain generals began to shift, depending on which branch of the family they hoped to gain favor with. Priam, wise as he was, could sense the tension, yet he believed he had time to mend it. He believed that order could always be restored, that the golden age he built would shield his city from the dangers that stalked weaker kingdoms. But no golden age lasts forever. Far beyond Troy's walls, the Aegean world was changing. Greek kings competed for dominance, each seeking new allies or new conquests. Storms shook the political horizon. Old rivalries rekindled. And in the midst of this shifting landscape stood Troy, wealthy, confident, brilliant, and increasingly tempting. History often moves quietly before it roars. And for Troy, the roar was approaching. The omens that flickered in the palace were not warnings of immediate doom, but of a slow unraveling, threads loosening one by one until nothing could hold the tapestry together. Priam's reign became a paradox, golden on the surface, fragile beneath. The king who united his people could not fully unite his own household. The palace that shone like a jewel masked the beginning of divisions that would shape the fate of the entire kingdom. And while Troy continued to thrive, the first shadows of the coming storm gathered just beyond the horizon, waiting for the moment when prosperity would blind the city to its own vulnerability. For empires rarely fall in an instant. They fall when greatness grows so bright that no one notices the cracks forming in the foundation. Troy under Priam had never shone brighter and never been more vulnerable. Chapter 3. The Prince Destined to Destroy. Before the torches of war lit the horizon, before the first Greek ship carved its way toward the shores of Ilium, Troy's fate narrowed to the fragile breath of a single newborn child. His name would one day echo across centuries. Paris, the shepherd prince, the judge of goddesses, the unwitting spark of a legendary war. But long before any of that, he was simply an omen, one that made even the bravest priests tremble. In the final months before his birth, the palace grew uneasy. Priam and Hecuba, rulers of a flourishing kingdom, should have been preparing for celebration. Instead, they found themselves surrounded by whispers. Strange dreams troubled Hecuba, visions of a torch in her arms, burning fiercely, devouring towers and gates. She woke shaken, convinced that something terrible moved within her womb. The priests, skilled in the old rites, were summoned. They studied the dreams, traced symbols in the dust, and cast offerings into the flame. What they saw in the rising smoke chilled them, a prophecy older than Troy's golden age, older even than the house of Ilus. A child would be born who would bring the city to ruin. It was not a warning spoken lightly. According to tradition, such visions had only surfaced in the gravest moments, times when divine forces shifted the fate of nations. And so, the seers approached Priam with heavy steps, carrying a truth no father should ever hear. His unborn son was destined to destroy the kingdom. Troy, already glittering beneath Priam's rule, could not risk the shadow of such a prophecy. And Priam, bound by the burden of kingship, found himself trapped between love and duty. The decision that weighed on him was not the decision of a father, but of a ruler whose city stood at the apex of its power. When Paris was born, the palace did not ring with celebration. No musicians played. No crowds gathered at the gates. Instead, the infant was wrapped quietly, carried out beneath the cover of dawn, and entrusted to loyal servants with a single order: leave the child to die upon the slopes of Mount Ida. It was a choice etched with sorrow, one that Priam believed would save Troy from the edge of a future catastrophe. Yet destiny, once set in motion, rarely yields to human will. Mount Ida rose like a silent giant to the southeast of Troy, its forests thick, its cliffs rugged, its paths known only to shepherds and wandering hunters. It was here the servants left the newborn prince, placing him at the base of a wild fig tree. The wind moved gently across his face, and for a moment the world seemed to hold its breath. But fate had already chosen its course. A shepherd named Agelaus found the child still alive, crying softly among the roots. Perhaps he believed the gods had spared the infant. Perhaps he simply could not bring himself to abandon a life so small and defenseless. Whatever moved his heart, that morning became one of the most consequential acts in ancient history. He carried the child home, raised him as his own, and gave him a name that carried no hint of royalty, Paris. The boy grew among the slopes of Ida, far from the marble halls and bronze gates that should have been his inheritance. He learned to tend sheep, to chase the wind across open fields, to listen for the quiet wisdom of the mountains. In these humble rhythms, he became known for his fairness and his kindness. He was strong, but gentle, confident, but not prideful. Those who met him felt an unusual warmth, as if the world itself softened in his presence. Yet something in Paris seemed touched by a destiny larger than the quiet life he knew. Travelers who crossed his path felt compelled to speak with him. Strangers confided things they did not understand. Even the animals followed him without fear. There was a magnetism to him, a subtle pull that hinted at the power hidden beneath his simple shepherd's cloak. Years passed, Troy thrived, and the prophecy, though not forgotten, drifted into the background of memory. Priam and Hecuba grew older, believing their terrible choice had saved the kingdom. But destiny moved in circles. A festival came, one of Troy's grand celebrations where contests were held in honor of the gods. Shepherds and common folk from the countryside often joined these games, competing alongside warriors and nobles. The air filled with laughter, drums, and the shimmer of bronzed shields. Among the crowd stood Paris, drawn not by ambition, but by simple curiosity. He entered the contests. He excelled at all of them. The people watched in growing astonishment. His speed matched Troy's finest runners. His aim surpassed the trained archers of the palace guard. His grace, his confidence, and the quiet power in his movements stirred something familiar in those who observed him. Whispers rose, then murmurs, then certainty. This young shepherd resembled the royal line. Priam himself watched from the terrace. His gaze narrowed, his breath stilled. Something in the boy's face, perhaps the shape of his eyes, perhaps the quiet strength of his posture, struck a forgotten chord. The king ordered the youth brought before him. In the marble hall, beneath the carved figures of ancestors, Paris stood humbly. He expected nothing. Yet when the truth surfaced, when the shepherd who raised him stepped forward trembling with guilt, when the memory of the prophecy returned with a weight that filled the room, the palace shifted as if struck by an unseen force. Priam realized the impossible. The son he had condemned had returned to him. And in a moment shaped by love rather than fear, Priam embraced Paris, choosing joy over caution, hope over destiny. The city rejoiced, unaware of the shadow entwined with their celebration. For by welcoming Paris home, the first step of the prophecy had been fulfilled. Troy had called back the very force fate had warned them to avoid. From that day forward, Paris walked within the palace as both prince and omen. He carried a charm that drew admiration, a beauty the poets would later immortalize, and a quiet confidence that made him stand out among Priam's many sons. But he also carried something else, something no one could see. The weight of Troy's destruction. And though the city's towers still shone, though laughter filled its halls and its markets overflowed with wealth, an ancient warning now stirred beneath the surface. Destiny had returned in human form, unaware of the fire sleeping in its hands. For the fall of great kingdoms often begins not with armies or alliances, but with the birth of a single life, one touched by forces far beyond the understanding of those who try to shape its fate. Paris, the forgotten infant of Mount Ida, had come home, and Troy's long night had begun. Chapter 4. A Judgment That Angered Heaven. Before Paris ever stepped onto the marble floors of Troy's palace, his fate was already entangled in a conflict far older than any mortal kingdom. His story, like a thread drawn taut across heaven and earth, began in the quiet meadows of Mount Ida, where the scent of pines lingered in the air and the world seemed untouched by war. Yet that peaceful slope became the stage for one of the most dangerous encounters in ancient myth, a moment when a mortal was asked to judge the vanity of gods. Paris was tending his flock when the first shadow moved across the grass. The old stories speak of a sudden stillness, as if nature itself paused to watch. From that hush emerged Hermes, the messenger god, radiant with purpose. Behind him appeared three figures cloaked not in mortal garments, but in the brilliance of the divine. Hera, queen of heaven, walked with the calm authority of a ruler who commanded storms. Athena, goddess of wisdom and war, carried the sharp clarity of battle in her gaze. And Aphrodite, born from sea foam, moved as though the world itself softened beneath her feet. They had not come to bless Paris. They had come to demand judgment. The golden apple, inscribed to the fairest, had sparked their rivalry, a single token that stirred divine pride into open challenge. None of the goddesses would yield. To let the others claim the title would be to surrender part of their power. And so Zeus, unwilling to choose among them, cast the burden upon Paris, believing a mortal shepherd might pass the verdict the heavens could not. It was a choice that would ripple across continents. Paris, bewildered, stood before them with the weight of eternity resting on his shoulders. Yet myths remind us that the gods rarely offer their requests empty-handed. Each goddess promised him a gift, one so tempting, so dazzling in its allure, that even the strongest mortal might waver. Hera offered him dominion, the rule over Asia itself, a kingdom that would stretch across the rising and setting sun. Athena offered him glory, wisdom beyond mortal reach, and victory in every battle he fought. Aphrodite offered him love, not merely affection, but the heart of the most beautiful woman in the world. Love, Paris knew, could topple kings and heal kingdoms. It could shape destinies more deeply than power or victory. And in that moment, standing among the pines, listening to promises that shimmered like heat across the horizon, his choice was made. He placed the golden apple in Aphrodite's hand. In doing so, Paris believed he had chosen beauty. What he truly chose was the future of Troy. For Hera and Athene did not forget. Gods in ancient thought were not distant, gentle creators. They were forces of will, capable of generosity, but equally capable of vengeance when slighted. And in Paris's decision, they saw an insult no mortal had the right to deliver. The world shifted that day, not in thunder or fire, but in a quiet turning, like the first subtle tremor before a mountain collapses. Aphrodite, triumphant, kept her promise. She guided Paris toward a destiny shaped not by power or wisdom, but by desire. She placed before him a vision of Helen of Sparta, a woman whose beauty poets would later struggle to describe. To many, Helen was not merely a queen. She was the embodiment of grace, a figure whose presence seemed touched by divine favor. From the moment Paris learned her name, his life began to move toward hers with the inevitability of a tide drawn by the moon. Yet love given by the gods often carries a hidden cost. For Helen was not free. She was the wife of Menelaus, king of Sparta, a ruler bound by alliances, brother to the powerful Agamemnon, and part of a world where honor outweighed the lives of nations. Aphrodite saw only her promise. Hera and Athene saw opportunity. To the offended goddesses, Paris's choice was not a simple matter of vanity. It was a challenge. And challenges, in the realm of myth, demanded balance. They turned their attention not only to Paris, but to the city that had welcomed him, celebrated him, and lifted him from shepherd to prince. Troy became the target of divine resentment. From that moment onward, every omen, every dream, every uneasy whisper within the palace took on new meaning. Priam's seers sensed the shift. Cassandra, already burdened by visions she could not escape, spoke of approaching flames, of ships gathering like a storm at sea, of walls shuddering beneath the weight of fate. But her warnings, as always, drifted unheard, carried away by a destiny too vast to be avoided. Meanwhile, Paris felt none of the dread that shadowed Troy. Aphrodite guided him with gentle certainty, leading him to Sparta where Helen lived behind the guarded doors of her kingdom. The meeting between them, whether shaped by divine enchantment or mortal longing, ignited a bond powerful enough to break alliances and erase caution. When Paris brought Helen to Troy, the world shifted again. To the city, she arrived like a blessing, a queen of unmatched beauty entering their golden walls. But to others across the Aegean, her disappearance became a wound that demanded redress. And far above, the gods watched. Hera's anger deepened, like gathering storm clouds. Athena's resentment hardened like iron beneath the earth. Both waited for the moment when their vengeance could fall not on the shepherd prince alone, but on the city that nurtured him. Thus the judgment on Mount Ida, the choice of a young man awakened to beauty, became the spark that lit the fuse of a war remembered for thousands of years. A war not only of men and kings, but of gods whose pride could shape the fate of nations. Paris believed he had won the love of the world's fairest woman. In truth, he had inherited a curse wrapped in beauty's guise. For when a mortal offends heaven, the punishment rarely strikes swiftly. It waits, gathering strength, choosing the moment when its descent will echo across the ages. And so the gods turned their gaze toward Troy, a city unaware that its greatest enemy was not an army approaching from across the sea, but a single decision made beneath the quiet pines of Mount Ida. Chapter 5. The Abduction that Ignited Empires. Before storms gather, the world often grows unnaturally calm. In the lands of Bronze Age Greece, that quiet came long before spears were raised or oars struck the sea. It began with a single voyage, one prince sailing across a restless Aegean, unaware that his journey would awaken memories older than kingdoms and resentments kept even by the gods. Paris of Troy, raised among shepherds yet born into prophecy, crossed the waves seeking honor after his fateful judgment among immortals. The winds carried him towards Sparta, a city known for discipline, stone, and kings who wielded power with the force of tradition. But beneath that stern exterior lay a legacy of beauty and myth, embodied in Helen, the woman poets would later call the face that launched 1,000 ships. In the heart of Sparta, under columns lit by steady fire, Helen received Paris not with suspicion, but with a grace that generations later would be whispered as enchantment. Some said she was swayed by Aphrodite's promise. Others believed fate had moved long before either of them took form. Yet ancient storytellers also preserved another truth, that the world rarely falls to catastrophe through a single moment. It collapses through chains of choices, each shaped by longing, pride, and the illusions of certainty. Helen was no stranger to prophecy. From girlhood, omens followed her, and kings battled for her hand as if competing for a sacred relic. Marriage to Menelaus of Sparta offered stability, but it could not silence the whispers that she was destined to shift the balance of nations. So when Paris entered her halls, carrying the calm of Ida and the confidence of one favored by a goddess, Helen felt the tremor of destiny approaching. Whether she stepped onto his ship by desire or under divine compulsion remains a mystery held tightly by time. But once sailcloth filled with wind and Sparta's shoreline faded behind them, a spark had been thrown into dry fields stretching across the Greek world. When Menelaus discovered her absence, his grief quickly hardened into fury. But behind that fury lay something deeper, fear that his honor, the sacred currency of kings, had been shattered. In this era, a ruler's worth lived in reputation, and a king whose household had been violated was a king who risked losing the loyalty of his allies. Menelaus turned to his brother Agamemnon, lord of Mycenae, a man whose ambition rivaled the mountains that guarded his citadel. Agamemnon saw in Helen's abduction an opportunity larger than justice. It became a banner he could raise to unite fractious Greek kingdoms under his command. With calls for revenge echoing through the Peloponnese, he invoked an ancient oath sworn years earlier by Helen's former suitors, a vow requiring all of them to protect her marriage, no matter the cost. Many had made that promise reluctantly, believing it would never be put to use. Now the oath became a weapon, binding kings and warriors into a coalition fueled by pride and compelled by honor. Across Greece, messengers carried the summons, the agging yet legendary Nestor, the cunning Odysseus who tried in vain to avoid the war he knew would be long and bitter, Achilles, young and nearly divine, burning with a hunger for glory that outshone caution. Each figure answered the call, and the sound of forging bronze spread through their lands like rolling thunder. But while Greece prepared its armies, Troy stood in a silence far more complex. Within Priam's halls, The return of Paris with Helen was both a celebration and a warning. The people of Troy admired her beauty, yet some murmured that no blessing arrives without its shadow. Priam, seasoned by decades of rule, recognized the danger, but he was a father before he was a king. He chose compassion for his son over the cold advice of his counselors. The elders argued that returning Helen might avert what was coming. Others felt that surrender would stain Troy's honor more deeply than war. Paris stood firm, convinced that destiny, and the goddess who had guided him, validated his claim. Helen remained beside him, a figure caught between admiration and blame, between personal desire and the title she could never escape, the woman worth fighting for. Far across the sea, Agamemnon ordered his fleet to assemble. Wooden hulls, carved with lions and serpents, crowded the shores of Aulis. Warriors packed supplies, families wept, and bards rehearsed epics they hoped would immortalize the suns marching toward an uncertain horizon. When the winds stalled, threatening the expedition, the Greeks turned to omens and sacrifices, acts that revealed a darker truth about the age, that even kings bent before fate as easily as shepherds did. At last, the winds shifted, and the fleet surged forward. From the coastline, it must have appeared as if the sea itself had sprouted wings of wood and cloth. Waves broke against hundreds of prows. Armor gleamed. Oars rose and fell with the rhythm of an approaching storm. Back in Troy, sentries gazed across the water, watching the distant specks grow larger with every hour. The city, once wrapped in prosperity and prophecy, now understood that it stood at the center of a conflict shaped by both mortal ambition and divine resentment. The abduction, whether a love story, a political misstep, or the unfolding of a curse, had become far more than an act between two people. It became the fuse of an empire-shaking war. The tension that followed was not just felt between nations, but within Trojan hearts. Fathers feared for their sons. Mothers lit incense for protection. Priests warned that the gods were already choosing sides. And as Paris and Helen walked the high terraces of the citadel, they carried the weight of consequences they could neither undo nor fully understand. When the Greek armada finally reached the Trojan shores, the sea darkened with sails. The world of myths stepped into the world of recorded memory. A personal choice had transformed into a conflict that would echo for centuries, retold in songs, carved into stone, and preserved in epic verse long after the ruins of Troy cooled under drifting sand. The abduction of Helen did not ignite a war simply because one man loved one woman. It ignited a war because humanity has always shaped destiny through desire and pride. And in that ancient moment, the desires of individuals collided with the ambitions of kings and the designs of gods. Even now, the story stands as a reminder. Empires may rise from courage, but they often fall from choices born in silence. Choices made not in the heat of battle, but in the quiet rooms where hearts decide what history will remember. Chapter 6: The First Clash of Armies. The Aegean Sea, once a ribbon of calm and glinting bronze, grew restless beneath the horizon. Hundreds of sails crowded its surface, catching the morning light like a moving forest of spears. The air carried the scent of salt and iron, and the sound of thousands of oars striking water in rhythm echoed, as if the ocean itself beat a warning drum. This was no ordinary crossing. It was a tide of men, hunger, and destiny converging upon the gates of Troy. The Greek coalition had come. Kings and warriors, bound by oaths, ambition, and the veneer of honor, arrived with the weight of centuries pressing upon them. Each ship carried not only soldiers, but also the ghosts of past quarrels, rivalries, and a shared desire for glory that would outlast their mortal lives. At their fore stood Agamemnon, his eyes set on Troy as though the city itself were a prize to be claimed, and yet also a mirror reflecting the fragile pride of all those assembled behind him. From the walls of Troy, Priam watched the approaching armada. The king, seasoned by decades of rule, understood the magnitude of what had come to his shores. The distant sails shimmered like a field of silver fire, and he felt the first tremor of fear that even wisdom cannot erase. Not for himself, not for Troy alone, but for the generations who would inherit this war, his children, his people, the blood that would be spilled before the gates. Troy's defenses were formidable. Stone walls, high and wide, rose above the plains where Greek ships now gathered. Towers bristled with archers. Ballistae were poised, ropes of fire and bronze ready to rain down upon the first landing parties. At the heart of this defense stood Hector, eldest son of Priam, whose presence brought a steadying rhythm to the city's heartbeat. Trained from youth in the arts of war, he commanded the troops with patience, courage, and a clarity that kept fear from overtaking discipline. His shadow moved across the walls, like a promise that Troy would not yield easily. The first clash came with the rising sun. Greek infantry advanced onto the beach, shields glinting, bronze helmets catching the light, swords raised in anticipation. But Troy's archers rained down arrows with precise lethality, and stones hurled from the battlements shattered formations before they could solidify. The first day ended in confusion, with neither side achieving decisive advantage. Blood stained sand and armor, yet the city stood firm. Priam observed all from the highest terrace, the weight of his lineage pressing upon him. He understood that this war was no longer simply about Helen, nor about honor. It had become a contest of wills, a collision of pride and ambition that would test the limits of men and gods alike. The Greeks fought not just to reclaim a queen, but to prove themselves worthy of their own names, their kingdoms, and their places in legend. Troy resisted not only to protect a city, but to uphold the dignity of a kingdom that had grown prosperous, confident, and haughty in its own right. Hector moved along the walls, shouting orders with measured authority. He directed archers to shift their aim, repositioned infantry to cover vulnerable sections, and inspired citizens to prepare boiling oil and sharpen stakes. Each action reflected not just strategy, but the understanding that the Greeks were patient and relentless. Troy's survival depended not on swift victory, but on endurance, on the ability to turn each day of resistance into another day of hope. By the second sunrise, the Greeks realized the challenge before them. Trojan walls, strengthened over generations, absorbed their best assaults. Siege engines were hurled against the gates, only to crumble under the weight of precision-laid stones. Archers and slingers repelled the first waves, and every failed assault fed frustration into the hearts of men who had sailed far to prove their valor. Meanwhile, Hector's command allowed Troy's defenders to move with a fluidity that appeared almost divine, soldiers flowing from tower to tower, archers shifting positions, citizens assisting wherever needed. Yet even in the midst of resilience, cracks began to form. The fighting was relentless. Supplies became strained, wounds multiplied, and the morale of defenders was tested by the unending presence of enemy banners on the horizon. Priam, though steadfast, understood the subtle truth. Wars of this scale are not concluded in single encounters. They are sieges of patience, calculations of attrition, and tests of the human spirit. Troy would not fall quickly, but it would be worn down, day by day, by the ceaseless momentum of ambition. The Greeks, too, felt the weight of uncertainty. Leaders argued over strategy, pride bristled at minor setbacks, and warriors quarreled over honor and position. Odysseus, cunning and perceptive, studied Troy with a calculating eye, seeking the weaknesses that might eventually tip the scales. Achilles, though yet to fully enter the fray, moved through the camp with restless energy, his presence a silent promise of devastation to come. Even these legendary figures, immortalized by poets, could not fully anticipate the determination etched into every stone of Troy's walls, or the courage that flowed through the veins of its defenders. By the third day, both sides recognized a grim reality. This war would not be resolved by a single battle. Each victory, each setback, only deepened the stakes. Greeks entrenched along the coastline, building temporary camps, stockpiling weapons and supplies, and preparing for months of conflict. Trojans repaired fortifications, trained new warriors, and sent envoys to neighboring cities to secure aid and alliances. The war had become not an expedition of revenge, but a protracted contest of endurance, a struggle over the very concept of power itself. Amid this unfolding siege, moments of humanity persisted. Children hid in basements and corridors, their mothers offering whispered prayers. Priests moved quietly among the troops, offering sacrifices to Athene and Apollo, beseeching protection for the city and its people. And yet, even these rituals were tinged with unease, for the gods had long since taken sides, and their favor was no longer guaranteed. The first clash of armies, though indecisive in outcome, left a mark that would echo for generations. It revealed that Troy's strength lay not only in walls and weapons, but in leadership, unity, and the courage of ordinary citizens. It also showed that Greek resolve was unbreakable, driven by ambition as much as the desire to avenge a queen. What began as a personal quarrel over Helen had escalated into a confrontation capable of reshaping the landscape of the Aegean world. As the sun set behind the Trojan hills, painting the city's walls in shades of gold and shadow, Priam stood once more upon the highest terrace. The horizon was quiet now, but he knew it was a temporary peace. Ships and warriors would return with dawn, and the conflict would continue. He understood that this was no fleeting war of emotion, but a siege of legacy, a contest of pride, power, and human endurance that would test the very foundations of his kingdom. In the silence that followed the first clash, Troy learned a fundamental truth, that wars are rarely about a single cause. They are born from desire, pride, and fear, carried forward by the hands of men who believe they control destiny, even as they march under the shadow of forces beyond their comprehension. For the defenders, every day would now be a test of resilience. Every arrow loosed from the walls, every stone dropped upon invaders, became an act of preservation. And for the attackers, every effort to breach the gates, every wound sustained, served as proof that even the strongest ambition must wrestle with the stubbornness of those determined to survive. The first clash of armies had ended, yet it had accomplished something far more lasting than victory or defeat. It revealed the true nature of the war to come, slow, consuming, and monumental. Troy and Greece had not merely begun a battle. They had begun a struggle that would define heroism, loyalty, and the tragedy of human ambition for centuries to come. And in that quiet twilight, as shadows lengthened across the battlements, and the Aegean reflected a sky burning with red and gold, Priam understood the weight of what had begun. This war would test everything Troy had built, everything its kings had dreamed, and everything its people held dear. The first clash had not resolved the conflict. It had only declared the war and set the stage for a siege that would endure for a generation. In the days that followed, the city would brace itself against forces both mortal and divine, learning that no wall, no weapon, and no wisdom could fully protect a kingdom against the unfolding of destiny. And yet, in that understanding, there was courage, a quiet, steadfast defiance that would echo long after the dust of Troy had settled. Chapter 7. Heroes Forged in Endless War. The war stretched on, long enough that seasons blurred into one another, and the Aegean sun rose and fell over two worlds separated by a narrow plain. On one side lay Troy, its walls scarred but unbroken, towers still glinting in the firelight of its defenders. On the other, the Greek encampment sprawled across the coastline, a city of tents, palisades, and endless preparation, where the tide of men moved with the rhythm of ambition and exhaustion. Years of battle had turned land and sky into witnesses, and every rise of smoke, every clang of bronze, seemed to echo across time. From the first clash, few names had risen above the masses. But now, as days became months and months became years, certain figures stepped into the light, carved by the unrelenting grind of war. Achilles, whose rage and skill inspired awe and terror alike, became a force that even the walls of Troy could scarcely contain. Odysseus, clever and patient, wove schemes that shifted tides, plotting strategies that danced like shadows around the city's defenses. Ajax, colossal and steadfast, held the front lines with the unbending strength of mountains. And Hector, prince of Troy, moved among his people with a measured courage, blending the precision of a commander with the protective instinct of a father. These were not ordinary warriors. They were embodiments of the conflict itself, humanity distilled into power, intellect, and bravery, tested against the endless calculus of death. Every battle honed them, every loss shaped them, and every victory, however small, was a fleeting reprieve before the next wave of fire and steel. Troy endured, not because it was unassailable, but because it had learned to adapt. Its walls grew taller in places, its gates reinforced, and its battlements filled with defenders trained not only in arms, but in anticipation of Greek ingenuity. Archers learned to strike not in single volleys, but in continuous rhythm. Slingers found precise angles where stones and lead could pierce armor, and cavalry patrolled the high ridges to anticipate attacks from the plain. Life within the city adjusted to the rhythms of siege. Markets shortened their hours, families stored grain, and blacksmiths worked tirelessly, hammering swords, spears, and shields for warriors who would return to the walls day after day. Yet even as Troy braced for the onslaught, the Greek encampment mirrored the same persistence. What began as a temporary staging ground became a permanent city of war. Tents gave way to wooden fortifications, supply lines were established across the plains, and soldiers drilled endlessly, their voices rising in chants that blended discipline with despair. Messengers ran between camps, orders were delivered, and councils of war debated endlessly over strategy, reflecting the depth of ambition and the fear of shame that gripped leaders who had bound themselves together in a singular purpose. Amid this unending rhythm of conflict, something remarkable emerged: respect. Even in the blood and fury, warriors glimpsed the valor of their counterparts. Hector, standing atop the walls, observing Achilles as he cut through ranks with unstoppable force, felt a mixture of fear and admiration. And Achilles, in the midst of rage and slaughter, recognized the courage and discipline of Troy's prince, knowing that this enemy was no mere obstacle, but a mirror of his own capacity for heroism. Odysseus, ever perceptive, noticed in Hector a combination of strategy and intuition that rivaled his own, while Ajax measured the strength of each Trojan warrior, appreciating endurance and spirit even as he faced them across the battlefield. Battles became stages not only for conquest, but for recognition, moments where mortal skill and divine favor intertwined, where each clash left an imprint not just on flesh and stone, but on memory itself. Time, in war, moves unevenly. Days can stretch into months, months into years, and yet every moment carries the weight of consequence. Within Troy, families grew accustomed to absence and loss. Mothers whispered prayers to Athene and Apollo, priests interpreted omens with increasing urgency, and children learned to move quietly through streets echoing with the sounds of war. On the Greek side, soldiers grew hardened, their youth fading into the marks of campaigns, their names becoming shorthand for skill or caution. Each generation that touched this war carried with it the weight of stories that would outlive them. The siege tested not only strength, but character. Fear became constant, yet courage persisted. Exhaustion clawed at men, yet determination refused to yield. The plain between city and camp became a theater where endurance was as decisive as a sharpened spear. Even the gods, whose interference lingered like shadows over both sides, seemed to watch in fascination as heroes carved themselves into legend not by destiny alone, but by relentless choice, by the act of standing firm when all else demanded retreat. Hector's leadership embodied this truth. He moved along the walls, rallying archers, repositioning defenders, and offering words of calm that resonated beyond the walls themselves. In his presence, men found steadiness amidst chaos, and yet he was not blind to mortality. He understood that each day could bring the death of a comrade, a brother, or a son. Still, he carried on, fully aware that courage is not the absence of fear, but the act of standing even when fear is overwhelming. Achilles, on the other hand, channeled fury as a weapon. Every strike, every charge, every duel became a measure of human potential, shaped by divine ancestry and relentless practice. His legend grew not only because of victories, but because of the certainty with which he approached combat, a certainty that made even the most confident Trojan warrior pause. Odysseus, though less physically imposing, carved victories from cunning and foresight, orchestrating maneuvers that left the strongest lines vulnerable, proving that intellect, too, could forge immortality in the eyes of history. And amid these titans, ordinary soldiers found themselves swept into legend. Each man who held a wall, who repelled a charge, who bore a standard or delivered a message across the field, became a participant in a narrative larger than himself, a narrative where individual valor was inseparable from collective fate. The war shaped people as much as they shaped it. transforming ordinary mortals into figures who, in future song and story, would be remembered not only for actions, but for the endurance and spirit they carried into the furnace of conflict. Years of bloodshed left scars on both land and memory. Plains were churned into mud and ash, forests were cleared for encampments, and the echoes of clashing bronze became a constant refrain. Yet through this, a pattern of honor emerged. Even enemies recognized skill and courage in one another, and a strange kinship grew between warriors caught in the machinery of destiny. These were not companions, nor friends, but mutual witnesses, men and women who understood that history would not forget their choices, their failures, or their triumphs. By the time the war had reached its midpoint, the Greek encampment had the permanence of a city. Troy's walls had been tested by relentless assault, and the heroes of both sides had become symbols of the war itself. Yet the conflict remained unresolved, a testament to the complexity of human ambition and the inescapable weight of fate. Victory and defeat had not yet found their place, and the cycles of bravery, loss, and endurance continued unbroken. In the quiet moments, when arrows ceased to fly and swords were sheathed for the night, both sides understood something essential. The war was not only a contest of armies, but a forging ground for greatness. It would define the generations that followed, the stories that were told, and the lessons of courage, pride, and human resilience. Heroes were not born. They were tempered in the unyielding fire of endless conflict, their legacies formed in sweat, blood, and the knowledge that each day could be the last. And so, as the sun sank behind Troy's walls and the fires of the Greek encampment burned steadily into night, the world held its breath. From the plains to the towers, from the tents to the battlements, men and women alike moved with the understanding that they were part of something eternal. Names like Hector, Achilles, Odysseus, and Ajax would be carried forward through song and story, not merely as warriors, but as reflections of human endurance under the watchful gaze of both mortals and gods. The endless war had forged them, and in forging them, it had forged the memory of Troy itself, resilient, defiant, and unforgettable. Even amid destruction, even amid sorrow, the light of human courage burned as brightly as any fire along the walls, a reminder that heroes exist not because they escape fate, but because they endure it. Chapter 9. The Death of the Pride of Troy. The plains before Troy's walls had grown silent, yet the air was thick with the memory of clashing bronze and the cries of the fallen. Dust swirled in faint eddies, carrying the scent of sweat, blood, and fire, a lingering testimony to years of relentless siege. It was here, beneath the shadow of the city's proud towers, that the fate of Troy's greatest champion would finally be decided. Hector, son of Priam, protector of the city and symbol of Trojan courage, moved with measured resolve. Every step he took was guided by honor, the weight of generations pressing upon him, and the knowledge that the eyes of his people and the gods were fixed upon this moment. Across the battlefield, Achilles approached, a figure both mortal and larger than life. His armor gleamed with the reflection of the sun, his shield a wall of bronze, his spear trembling with anticipation. Fury had long replaced caution in his heart, a burning fire fueled by personal betrayal and unending grief for fallen comrades. Where Hector fought for duty, Achilles fought for vengeance. Where Hector sought to defend his city, Achilles sought to destroy it. Yet in this collision, both were bound by the same thread that war has always spun: destiny. The duel began not with words, but with motion. Spears and shields collided, sending echoes across the plain. Hector's strength and skill, honed through years of defending his homeland, met Achilles' rage and divine lineage in a clash that shook the battlefield. Each strike was a statement, each parry a negotiation with mortality itself. Warriors and onlookers alike held their breath as the two champions danced upon the sands of history, their movements choreographed by necessity, instinct, and the unyielding pull of fate. Hector struck with precision, aiming to end the confrontation quickly and preserve his city, yet Achilles met every blow with relentless ferocity. It became clear that the battle was not merely for victory, but for legacy. Each knew that the eyes of posterity watched. Each understood that this moment, brief as it might be in human perception, would echo through song and stone for centuries to come. The clash culminated in a devastating strike. Achilles, guided by the searing edge of rage and the favor of the gods, pierced the mortal shield of Troy's protector. Hector fell, his body collapsing upon the plain, dust rising around him like a shroud. Silence, heavier than any cry, descended upon the battlefield. Soldiers of both sides froze. Arrows hung in the air. For a fleeting heartbeat, even the wind seemed to pause, mourning the fall of a hero whose courage had defined the city itself. Achilles' triumph, however, was no cause for celebration. His fury, raw and unrelenting, desecrated Hector's body, dragging it behind his chariot in a display meant to strike terror into the hearts of Troy's people. The streets of the city erupted with grief. Women wailed, children clung to the walls, and men lowered their heads in sorrow and anger. Troy's pride had fallen, and with it, the spirit of its defense seemed to tremble. The prince who had embodied courage, wisdom, and the protection of his homeland now lay dishonored upon the sands of the plain. Within the walls, Priam, king and father, felt a pain that pierced beyond the physical wounds of war. Age and experience did not temper grief, they sharpened it. His beloved son, his heir, the very embodiment of Trojan honor, had been struck down by the hand of the most fearsome of the Greeks. Yet amid this despair, Priam's courage endured. For in grief alone no city stands. Action, even in sorrow, was required. By nightfall, Priam undertook what seemed impossible. Alone and unarmed, he crossed the plain to the Greek encampment. The path was treacherous, shadowed by soldiers who might not recognize mercy in a king's approach. But he moved with purpose, each step a testament to paternal love that transcends fear, pride, and the fury of the battlefield. The camp was quiet enough for the murmurs of history to settle around him, the same camp where Achilles, wrath had desecrated the body of Troy's greatest defender. When Priam finally stood before Achilles, the contrast was stark. The old king, fragile in years but immense in resolve, facing the immortal fury of a warrior at the peak of his rage. Priam's voice, quiet yet unwavering, pleaded not for vengeance, but for mercy. He invoked memory, honor, and the common humanity that binds even enemies. Fathers, sons, the cycle of birth and death, and the fleeting nature of all life under the watch of the gods. Achilles, though still consumed by grief and fury, listened. The encounter became a moment suspended outside of time, a pause in the relentless tide of war. Priam's courage and humility reached something within the Greek warrior that words alone could not touch, the recognition that even the fiercest of vengeance can be tempered by the raw, unyielding force of love. Slowly, painfully, Achilles relented. He allowed the body of Hector to be returned, an act of mercy that acknowledged the shared humanity of both sides. The procession back to Troy was quiet, somber, and sacred. Citizens lined the streets, mourning their prince, their protector, and the hope that he had embodied. Priam carried the dignity of grief itself, moving among his people with a presence that reminded them of the resilience of the human spirit, even in the face of the irreparable. For while Hector's life had ended, the meaning of his courage endured, etched into the city's memory and destined to echo through history. In the aftermath, Troy reflected on the duality of war, the triumph of skill and the terror of loss, the fleeting nature of vengeance and the enduring power of honor. Hector's death was more than the fall of a single warrior. It was a turning point that revealed the delicate balance between pride and survival, rage and compassion, human ambition and divine design. The city learned that heroes are not only measured by the victories they achieve, but by the legacy of courage they leave in the hearts of those who survive them. The image of Priam, an old king bending before a young killer to reclaim his son, became one of the most haunting moments in history. It spoke of the fragility of life, the depth of parental love, and the moral weight that even the greatest warriors must eventually confront. It reminded all who heard the story that mercy can exist even amidst the fury of war, that grief can coexist with bravery, and that human dignity can shine, however briefly, against the darkness of destruction. And so, as night fell over Troy, the city mourned, the walls trembling with sorrow yet still standing. Hector, the pride of Troy, had been struck down, but in the memory of his deeds, the courage he inspired, and the mercy that followed his death, he became immortal. The war would continue, relentless as ever, but the lessons of this day, of love, honor, rage, and reconciliation, would endure. Even in the face of despair, even when the greatest of warriors fall, history preserves the echo of courage. Hector's life, his death, and the tender moment between father and son would resonate through generations, a reminder that amid the chaos of war, the human heart endures, witnesses, and remembers. Chapter 9. The Death of the Pride of Troy. The plains before Troy's walls had grown silent, yet the air was thick with the memory of clashing bronze and the cries of the fallen. Dust swirled in faint eddies, carrying the scent of sweat, blood, and fire, a lingering testimony to years of relentless siege. It was here, beneath the shadow of the city's proud towers, that the fate of Troy's greatest champion would finally be decided. Hector, son of Priam, protector of the city and symbol of Trojan courage, moved with measured resolve. Every step he took was guided by honor, the weight of generations pressing upon him, and the knowledge that the eyes of his people and the gods were fixed upon this moment. Across the battlefield, Achilles approached, a figure both mortal and larger than life. His armor gleamed with the reflection of the sun, his shield a wall of bronze, his spear trembling with anticipation. Fury had long replaced caution in his heart, a burning fire fueled by personal betrayal and unending grief for fallen comrades. Where Hector fought for duty, Achilles fought for vengeance. Where Hector sought to defend his city, Achilles sought to destroy it. Yet in this collision, both were bound by the same thread that war has always spun: destiny. The duel began not with words, but with motion. Spears and shields collided, sending echoes across the plain. Hector's strength and skill, honed through years of defending his homeland, met Achilles' rage and divine lineage in a clash that shook the battlefield. Each strike was a statement, each parry a negotiation with mortality itself. Warriors and onlookers alike held their breath as the two champions danced upon the sands of history, their movements choreographed by necessity, instinct, and the unyielding pull of fate. Hector struck with precision, aiming to end the confrontation quickly and preserve his city. Yet Achilles met every blow with relentless ferocity. It became clear that the battle was not merely for victory, but for legacy. Each knew that the eyes of posterity watched. Each understood that this moment, brief as it might be in human perception, would echo through song and stone for centuries to come. The clash culminated in a devastating strike. Achilles, guided by the searing edge of rage and the favor of the gods, pierced the mortal shield of Troy's protector. Hector fell, his body collapsing upon the plain, dust rising around him like a shroud. Silence, heavier than any cry, descended upon the battlefield. Soldiers of both sides froze. Arrows hung in the air. For a fleeting heartbeat, even the wind seemed to pause, mourning the fall of a hero whose courage had defined the city itself. Achilles' triumph, however, was no cause for celebration. His fury, raw and unrelenting, desecrated Hector's body, dragging it behind his chariot in a display meant to strike terror into the hearts of Troy's people. The streets of the city erupted with grief. Women wailed, children clung to the walls, and men lowered their heads in sorrow and anger. Troy's pride had fallen, and with it, the spirit of its defense seemed to tremble. The prince who had embodied courage, wisdom, and the protection of his homeland now lay dishonored upon the sands of the plain. Within the walls, Priam, king and father, felt a pain that pierced beyond the physical wounds of war. Age and experience did not temper grief, they sharpened it. His beloved son, his heir, the very embodiment of Trojan honor, had been struck down by the hand of the most fearsome of the Greeks. Yet amid this despair, Priam's courage endured. For in grief alone no city stands. Action, even in sorrow, was required. By nightfall, Priam undertook what seemed impossible. Alone and unarmed, he crossed the plain to the Greek encampment. The path was treacherous, shadowed by soldiers who might not recognize mercy in a king's approach. But he moved with purpose, each step a testament to paternal love that transcends fear, pride, and the fury of the battlefield. The camp was quiet enough for the murmurs of history to settle around him, the same camp where Achilles, wrath had desecrated the body of Troy's greatest defender. When Priam finally stood before Achilles, the contrast was stark. The old king, fragile in years but immense in resolve, facing the immortal fury of a warrior at the peak of his rage. Priam's voice, quiet yet unwavering, pleaded not for vengeance, but for mercy. He invoked memory, honor, and the common humanity that binds even enemies. Fathers, sons, the cycle of birth and death, and the fleeting nature of all life under the watch of the gods. Achilles, though still consumed by grief and fury, listened. The encounter became a moment suspended outside of time, a pause in the relentless tide of war. Priam's courage and humility reached something within the Greek warrior that words alone could not touch, the recognition that even the fiercest of vengeance can be tempered by the raw, unyielding force of love. Slowly, painfully, Achilles relented. He allowed the body of Hector to be returned, an act of mercy that acknowledged the shared humanity of both sides. The procession back to Troy was quiet, somber, and sacred. Citizens lined the streets, mourning their prince, their protector, and the hope that he had embodied. Priam carried the dignity of grief itself, moving among his people with a presence that reminded them of the resilience of the human spirit, even in the face of the irreparable. For while Hector's life had ended, the meaning of his courage endured, etched into the city's memory and destined to echo through history. In the aftermath, Troy reflected on the duality of war, the triumph of skill and the terror of loss, the fleeting nature of vengeance and the enduring power of honor. Hector's death was more than the fall of a single warrior. It was a turning point that revealed the delicate balance between pride and survival, rage and compassion, human ambition and divine design. The city learned that heroes are not only measured by the victories they achieve, but by the legacy of courage they leave in the hearts of those who survive them. The image of Priam, an old king bending before a young killer to reclaim his son, became one of the most haunting moments in history. It spoke of the fragility of life, the depth of parental love, and the moral weight that even the greatest warriors must eventually confront. It reminded all who heard the story that mercy can exist even amidst the fury of war, that grief can coexist with bravery, and that human dignity can shine, however briefly, against the darkness of destruction. And so, as night fell over Troy, the city mourned, the walls trembling with sorrow yet still standing. Hector, the pride of Troy, had been struck down, but in the memory of his deeds, the courage he inspired, and the mercy that followed his death, he became immortal. The war would continue, relentless as ever, but the lessons of this day, of love, honor, rage, and reconciliation, would endure. Even in the face of despair, even when the greatest of warriors fall, history preserves the echo of courage. Hector's life, his death, and the tender moment between father and son would resonate through generations, a reminder that amid the chaos of war, the human heart endures, witnesses, and remembers. Chapter 11. The Final Gambit of Odysseus. After 10 long years of siege, the plains before Troy had grown familiar with the sounds of war, the clash of bronze against bronze, the cries of the fallen, and the relentless rhythm of siege engines battering the city's walls. Yet despite every effort, Troy remained unconquered, its towers still defiant, its people still enduring. Exhaustion had taken root in the Greek ranks. Courage alone could no longer tilt the scales. The strategy of force had failed. And so the Greeks turned to that most subtle of weapons, the mind of Odysseus. Odysseus, a man as formidable in thought as any warrior was in combat, surveyed the battlefield with eyes sharpened by years of war. He understood that brute strength alone could not breach Troy's fortifications. He recognized the stubbornness of its people, the resilience forged by decades of prosperity, prophecy, and defense. Victory, he concluded, would require cunning, deception woven with precision, exploiting both hope and hubris. The solution was audacious, the kind that risked both glory and failure. A wooden horse, enormous and hollow, crafted to appear as a gift, a symbol of Greek surrender and supposed respect for the city's enduring might. The horse was more than wood. It was a vessel of trust and misdirection, carefully constructed to conceal the warriors who would later emerge to strike at the heart of Troy. Its massive form loomed over the sand, polished and carved to catch the attention and the awe of those who might see it as a gesture of peace. The Greeks abandoned their camp along the coastline, leaving only the horse, and a small contingent to suggest retreat. The rest withdrew under the cover of night, their ships retreating beyond the horizon, leaving Troy to contemplate the appearance of sudden fortune. Within Troy, reactions were mixed. Some saw the horse as a divine sign, an offering from the gods, and a token of victory they had long been denied. Others, tempered by caution and the wisdom of experience, whispered warnings, skeptical of gifts delivered after years of siege. Yet the city's joy and desire for triumph were irresistible. The walls that had long endured the battering of Greek siege engines now gazed upon the wooden structure with fascination and a fragile hope that perhaps, after so much suffering, the war had finally ended. Priam, king and custodian of the city, debated the decision with the council of elders. Doubt and prudence warred against the allure of perceived victory. The priests spoke in measured tones, interpreting the flight of birds and the omens in the sacred flames. They cautioned patience, yet the people of Troy, exhausted by conflict, inclined toward belief in the gift's promise. Pride whispered alongside hope. The city had survived, and now the Greeks, weary and humbled, offered what appeared to be acknowledgement of Troy's greatness. The horse, colossal and silent, was drawn into the heart of the city, past the gates and along streets scarred by years of siege. Citizens pressed close, marveling at its construction, unaware that within its hollow frame lay the best warriors of Greece, poised to strike at the apex of opportunity. They had been trained for this moment, disciplined in stealth, and guided by the intelligence of Odysseus himself, whose understanding of human nature and the psychology of triumph had created a weapon invisible in plain sight. By nightfall, Troy had celebrated its apparent victory. Songs of joy echoed along the ramparts, children danced in the streets, and the walls were adorned with banners proclaiming endurance and triumph. The Greek fleet, long thought to have abandoned the siege, had vanished beyond the horizon. Hope had a palpable weight in the city. The enemy seemed distant, and for the first time in a decade, the people allowed themselves to breathe. Yet beneath the surface of celebration, the quiet tension of fate lingered, subtle as a shadow in a sunlit room. Odysseus' plan required patience, a measured delay before the hidden strike could unfold. Inside the horse, Greek warriors remained motionless, enduring the hours with stoic discipline. Their hearts beat in unison with the anticipation of the final act, aware that discovery would mean death, and success would mean the culmination of years of strategy and sacrifice. The wooden horse, an object of perceived reverence and awe, became a vessel not of peace, but of inevitability. As the night deepened, Troy's gates closed for the evening, its citizens retreating to homes and palaces with the belief that the war was finally over. Silence descended, punctuated only by distant cries of watchmen and the occasional sigh of wind through the streets. Within the horse, warriors readied themselves, the gravity of history pressing against every thought. The city slept, vulnerable, yet unknowing, blinded by desire for deliverance and distracted by the fragile euphoria of temporary triumph. Then, when the hour was ripe, the trap revealed itself. Warriors emerged from the horse's hollow belly, swift and silent, seizing control of gates and streets with practiced precision. The illusion of surrender shattered like brittle wood. Chaos erupted as Greek forces, returning under the cover of darkness, struck with coordinated force, exploiting every weakness in walls long thought impregnable. Fires ignited along rooftops, and the clash of steel echoed as the city that had once been so proud now faced the sudden and terrifying reality of defeat. Priam, his heart heavy with dread, watched from the heights of the palace as the culmination of years of siege unfolded in moments. Citizens screamed, warriors fell, and the streets became a labyrinth of panic and despair. The gods, whose influence had shadowed every action and decision throughout the decade-long conflict, now observed the final act, their favor or disfavor inscrutable and absolute. Troy's destiny, so long intertwined with prophecy, human ambition, and divine oversight, had reached its critical moment. The cunning of Odysseus had reshaped the battlefield entirely. Where strength had failed, intelligence had prevailed. The war that had consumed a generation ended not with a prolonged clash of armies, but with a decisive stroke, a triumph born of foresight, patience, and the ruthless understanding of human desire. Troy, which had endured assaults and sieges for 10 long years, now faced a collapse both swift and inexorable. Yet even in destruction, the story of the city was not reduced to mere tragedy. Within the wooden horse, the courage and discipline of Greek warriors became legend. Within Troy, the heroism of defenders, the endurance of citizens, and the leadership of Priam and Hector endured in memory and song. The fall of the city would be remembered not solely as a loss of walls and wealth, but as the moment when human ingenuity, ambition, and divine oversight converged to shape the destiny of an empire. When dawn broke over the smouldering city, the plains were littered with remnants of pride, courage, and ambition. Troy, once the jewel of the Aegean, had fallen, but its story had been etched into eternity. The wooden horse, a symbol of cunning, despair, and the unpredictable interplay of human minds, remained as a haunting testament to the final gambit of Odysseus, a reminder that victory often comes not through force alone, but through understanding, patience, and the willingness to manipulate the perception of trust. History would remember Troy for its walls, its heroes, and its tragedies, but it would also remember the moment when cleverness overcame strength, when hope blinded judgment, and when a city, resilient for a decade, succumbed to the brilliance of a single mind. The Greeks, having played the long game of strategy and deception, secured their victory, and the echoes of their cunning would resonate across generations. In the final hours, the city that had endured prophecy, war, and loss became a monument to the delicate balance of human ambition and divine design. Troy's fate, long predicted, had come to pass, not through brute force alone, but through the subtleties of deception and the inexorable march of destiny. The wooden horse, silent and hollow, symbolized both the ingenuity of men and the fragility of trust, leaving a lesson that would endure far beyond the fall of walls, the cries of battle, and the ashes of empire. Troy had fallen, the war was over, and the final gambit of Odysseus, a masterpiece of cunning and patience, had reshaped history forever. Chapter 12. The Night Troy Let Its Guard Fall. The city of Troy, scarred by a decade of siege and tempered by countless battles, found itself at a precipice between caution and hope. The wooden horse loomed outside the walls, its massive frame casting a long shadow upon the plain as sunlight faded toward dusk. It was at once magnificent and ominous, a strange monument of wood and mystery that demanded both attention and interpretation. Inside its hollow belly, Greek warriors waited in absolute stillness, their armor muffled, their breaths shallow, their minds sharpened for the moment they would strike. Outside, the city debated, unaware that the night itself would become the instrument of destiny. Within the council chambers, voices rose and fell in tense debate. Priam's advisors, veterans of war and men long accustomed to reading the signs of gods and men alike, argued over the nature of the horse. Some saw it as a gift, a token of surrender and respect from a weary enemy. Others, wary of cunning and mindful of past treacheries, urged destruction, fire, or at least scrutiny. The priests, interpreting omens from the flight of birds and the flicker of sacred flames, cautioned patience, warning that divine retribution was seldom delayed without purpose. Yet the city, exhausted by siege and longing for relief, leaned toward hope. Hope, a fragile and dangerous force, prevailed. As the decision was made, the horse was drawn through the gates, past the fortified walls, along streets worn by the march of soldiers and the passage of time. Citizens lined the roads, marveling at its construction, celebrating the apparent victory that had eluded them for so long. Torches flared along the walls and in homes, illuminating the wood's polished curves and the intricate carvings designed to awe and impress. The air was heavy with expectation, mingling relief, pride, and a dangerous complacency. The city had survived for 10 years against the mightiest of Greek forces. Surely, they reasoned, they had earned the right to believe in fortune's favor. That evening, Troy's gates closed in routine vigilance, yet an invisible thread of peril had already been woven into the night. Citizens sang, children danced, and elders offered quiet prayers to gods both benevolent and vengeful. The streets were alive with celebration, yet the shadows beneath the torches lengthened, moving like silent witnesses to the events yet to unfold. Every laugh and cheer carried an unintended irony. The horse, silent and patient, concealed the very agents of destruction the city had long sought to repel. Within the hollow of the wooden structure, Greek warriors waited with disciplined patience. Time was measured in heartbeats, breaths, and the faint creak of wood beneath the tension of their weight. Each warrior understood the stakes. Discovery meant death. Failure meant delay and perhaps defeat. The night itself seemed to pause, holding its breath, as if recognizing the singularity of this moment in the grand sweep of history. The soldiers' eyes reflected a mixture of fear, anticipation, and the grim satisfaction of purpose fulfilled. As darkness deepened, the city continued to revel, oblivious to the perils within its own walls. Priam, weary from leadership and mourning the loss of Hector, walked among his people, sensing in subtle instinct that caution had been set aside. Yet the desire for peace, the yearning for triumph after 10 years of relentless siege, was stronger than apprehension. The horse had become a symbol not of danger, but of relief, a misjudgment that would soon resonate with the inexorability of fate. When the hour arrived, silence descended like a shroud. The streets of Troy, still echoing with celebration, began to witness the unfolding of a plan that had been years in conception. From the belly of the horse, Greek warriors emerged, moving with precision honed by experience and strategy. Their feet barely made a sound upon the stone and sand. Each step brought them closer to the gates, closer to turning hope into catastrophe, closer to delivering Troy into the hands of destiny. At the outer walls, the first of the concealed soldiers slipped past the guards, exploiting the complacency born of triumph. Gates, long held against invaders and siege engines, were silently opened, allowing the returning Greek fleet to slip back into the harbor under cover of darkness. The ships that had been absent for so long returned like phantoms, dark hulls gliding silently against the reflection of the moon upon the water. The stage was set for devastation. The culmination of strategy, patience, and the long shadow of prophecy was at hand. Inside Troy, celebration continued, yet it now carried the seeds of its own undoing. Citizens were unaware that the very structure they had welcomed had become a Trojan horse in the literal sense, a vessel of destruction concealed within the guise of hope. Their triumph, long anticipated and long deserved in their minds, had blinded them to the lessons of vigilance, to the whisper of doubt, to the enduring truths that the gods had always sought to convey. That pride, even when coupled with endurance, can invite ruin. The Greeks, once thought defeated, now moved with swift precision, taking control of key gates and strategic points within the city. Resistance was sporadic. Confusion reigned. The city's defenders, though brave, were unprepared for the betrayal concealed within their midst. Fires ignited along streets, echoing the chaos that had long been promised in prophecy. The night sky bore witness to the convergence of human error, divine will, and calculated deception. Troy, which had eluded fate for so long, was finally caught in the web woven by both gods and men. Priam, observing from the heights of the palace, could only bear witness as his city fell into disarray. The lessons of courage, resilience, and endurance, embodied for so long in the figure of Hector, seemed now to vanish under the tide of Greek cunning. Citizens fled or fought desperately. Walls that had held against siege engines now proved irrelevant against the subtleties of strategy and human misjudgment. The night, which had begun as a celebration, became a crucible of terror, grief, and irreversible change. The Greeks, led by the discipline and intellect of Odysseus, completed the final stage of their plan. Gates opened fully, the fleet poured into the harbor, and the city that had survived decade after decade found itself overwhelmed not by brute strength, but by the clever application of patience, deception, and an understanding of human desire. Troy's fall was swift, yet it had been prepared over years of siege, loss, and divine observation, a culmination of human ambition and the inexorable movement of fate. By dawn, Troy had been irrevocably altered. Streets that had once echoed with the pride of citizens now carried the cries of panic and grief. Towers, once symbols of resilience and strategic foresight, were compromised. The wooden horse, silent and patient in the night, had fulfilled its purpose, transforming from a monument of hope into the instrument of destiny. The city that had eluded prophecy for 10 years had finally been ensnared, not by walls, weapons, or brute force, but by the interplay of human desire, misjudgment, and calculated ingenuity. In the quiet aftermath, history would remember this night not simply as a fall, but as a turning point that demonstrated the fragile boundary between hope and hubris. Troy's greatest misjudgment, welcoming what appeared to be a gift, revealed the subtle yet decisive power of strategy, perception, and the inexorable pull of fate. The prophecy that had long hovered over the city, once deferred through courage, endurance, and leadership, had finally come to fruition. The night Troy let its guard fall was a moment when human error, divine oversight, and the cunning of a single mind converged. It was a testament to the paradox of hope. When celebrated without caution, it can blind the vigilant and open the gates to destruction. Troy's fate, once postponed, now unfolded in full, irrevocable consequence, leaving lessons of prudence, vigilance, and the inescapable hand of destiny etched into memory. As the sun rose over the plains and the walls of a fallen city, the echoes of that night reverberated through history. Troy had endured for centuries, resisted siege and war, and yet it succumbed not to force alone, but to the subtle precision of intellect, the seduction of hope, and the tragic miscalculation of human hearts. The wooden horse remained as a silent symbol, an eternal reminder that the gates we choose to open, whether to hope, pride, or desire, may become the instruments of our undoing. Chapter 13. Fire consumes the sacred city. The night that Troy had long feared had finally arrived. Where once the city had stood as a jewel of stone, rising proudly above the plains and overlooking the Aegean waves, now darkness was filled with the scent of smoke and the crackle of flame. The wooden horse, silent and patient, had delivered the Greeks into the heart of the city. Now every street, every square, every household became a stage for destruction. The city that had endured a decade of siege, survived countless assaults, and inspired generations with its resilience, was engulfed in fire. Its legacy threatened to vanish in a single night. The invaders moved with relentless precision. Greek warriors, once hidden, now surged through the streets with unyielding purpose, their armor glinting faintly in the flickering light of torches. They struck at soldiers, civilians, and structures alike, leaving no distinction between the guilty and the innocent. Flames leapt from rooftops, climbing wooden beams and feeding upon the all-soaked city. The sacred temples, symbols of devotion and divine favor, were not spared. Their altars cracked under heat, idols tumbled, and the prayers of a generation were drowned in smoke. Towers that had once defied catapults and battering rams now offered only fragile shelter before the conflagration. Within the palace, Priam, king of Troy, bore the full weight of the city's doom. Age and wisdom lent him no advantage against the sudden onslaught. He sought sanctuary beside the altar, clinging to the hope that the sacred might shield him from mortal vengeance. Yet even here, the hand of fate struck with merciless clarity. Priam was killed, his life extinguished amid the ruins of the divine he had long revered, the echo of his dynasty ending as abruptly as the flames that consumed his halls. In that moment, the human and the divine intertwined, grief and horror becoming inseparable beneath the shadow of the city's burning towers. Through the streets, cries of anguish reverberated against walls now swollen with heat and smoke. Families fled in confusion and terror, their paths obstructed by fire and collapsing structures. Children clung to parents who themselves struggled to maintain balance between survival and despair. The very essence of Troy, its people, its culture, its history, was swept into a tide of chaos, leaving nothing untouched. The city's proud defenses, honed over decades, now seemed fragile against the cunning and determination that the Greeks had brought within. Outside, the returning Greek fleet anchored under the cloak of night, their arrival synchronized with the signal sent from the horse. Ships, once mere shadows upon the horizon, now disgorged soldiers who surged into the streets, amplifying the terror. Their advance was unstoppable, a tide that could not be resisted. Every intersection, every gate, every rampart that had long been the backbone of Troy's defense was now a conduit for destruction. What years of endurance, skill, and courage had safeguarded, human ambition and strategy now tore apart in hours. The fires moved with unpredictable appetite, consuming homes, granaries, and workshops. Sparks caught in the wind, spreading rapidly from street to street, devouring all in their path. Temples dedicated to gods and heroes alike became unrecognizable husks, their charred columns standing as grim monuments to the futility of mortal pride in the face of both human ingenuity and divine oversight. The soundscape was filled with the roar of fire, the shouts of warriors, and the heart-wrenching cries of those caught in the relentless surge. It was a symphony of catastrophe, orchestrated by cunning, guided by destiny, and amplified by human error. Even as Troy burned, there were fleeting acts of courage. Citizens tried desperately to save what they could, carrying family, grain, and relics from the city's storied past. Soldiers, exhausted and grieving, attempted to resist the invaders' momentum, to salvage dignity in the face of inevitable loss. These acts, though valiant, were tragically insufficient. The Greek forces, trained in both stealth and strategy, had anticipated resistance and met it with precision. Each moment of heroism was overtaken by another wave of devastation, leaving a city that had been proud and resilient now teetering on the edge of annihilation. Among the ruins, the weight of prophecy and history intertwined. Troy, which had survived so long, had seemed for decades to defy fate itself. The warnings of seers, the omens from priests, the subtle signs from the gods, all had pointed to this outcome. And now, as fire consumed walls and roofs alike, the inevitability of destiny was undeniable. The city's pride, once a source of strength, had become a vulnerability. The same forces that had preserved it for 10 years, loyalty, courage, and hope, had been manipulated into blindness, leaving the city vulnerable to deception, to ambition, and to the inexorable designs of fate. The night stretched on, unrelenting. Smoke filled the sky, blotting out stars that had once been silent witnesses to Troy's endurance. The cries of the innocent echoed across the burning plains, carrying grief and despair into eternity. Flames licked the towers and spires that had resisted siege engines, and yet now succumbed to the invisible siege of strategy and timing. Troy's citizens, once proud and defiant, fled wherever the fire would allow, their homes and history reduced to embers and ash. By dawn, the city's form was recognizable only in ruins. Smoke still rose from the remains of towers and streets, while scattered survivors stumbled through the destruction, dazed and grieving. Troy, a city that had withstood the relentless test of time and war, now lay broken, not from the force of arms alone, but from the combination of betrayal, manipulation, and the heavy hand of destiny. The Greeks, having executed their plan with precision and patience, had turned a decade-long stalemate into a single, decisive night of destruction. Even in ruin, Troy's story persisted. Its walls, once formidable, now served as a testament to the fragility of human ambition when confronted by cunning and fate. Priam's death, the loss of the city's defenders, and the engulfing fire left an indelible mark on history, a warning that pride and hope unchecked can invite downfall. And yet within this catastrophe lay enduring lessons of courage, resilience, and the tragic interplay between human choice and divine design. The fire that consumed Troy illuminated not only the city's demise, but also the enduring truth of history. No fortress, no matter how high or well built, can escape the convergence of strategy, deception, and fate. The fall of Troy, immortalized in song and story, became both a tragedy and a lesson, a reminder that cities, like men, are subject to forces beyond their control, and that even the proudest walls cannot resist the consequences of misjudgment and destiny's inexorable flow. And so, as the sun rose over the ashes, Troy, once the jewel of the Aegean, was forever changed. The city that had endured prophecy, siege, and generations of warriors had finally succumbed. The flames that consumed it were not only a signal of defeat, but also a monument to the subtle interplay of human ingenuity, divine oversight, and the relentless march of fate. Troy was gone, yet in its destruction, its legacy endured, echoing through time as a testament to the power of both human ambition and the inescapable will of destiny. Chapter 14. Survivors Among Ruins and Ash. Dawn broke over the plains where Troy had once stood, and the city that had resisted the will of kings, warriors, and gods alike now lay in silent ruin. Smoke still rose from smouldering walls, and the scent of charred wood and melted stone lingered heavily in the morning air. The streets, once vibrant with life, were empty, save for scattered remnants of belongings, broken weapons, and the occasional shadow of a figure moving cautiously through the devastation. Troy, the jewel of the Aegean, had been reduced to ash, and yet in this apparent annihilation, the first stirrings of survival began to emerge. Amid the wreckage, a small group of Trojans gathered. They moved quietly, careful to avoid the Greek forces that remained in and around the city, yet each carried a determination beyond mere survival. Among them was Aeneas, son of Anchises and Aphrodite, a prince whose life had been shaped by duty, divine favor, and the prophecy that had long foretold the endurance of Troy's bloodline. His face bore the weariness of battle, grief, and the weight of leadership, yet his eyes held a resolve unbroken by the fires that had consumed his homeland. With a steady hand and measured voice, he rallied those who would follow, guiding them away from the ruins that still smoked under the morning sun. The survivors were not only warriors, but families, elders, and children, all united by a shared determination to preserve what remained of their identity. They carried with them the artifacts of Troy, fragments of scrolls, sacred relics, and heirlooms that told of a civilization steeped in history, prophecy, and culture. Each object, though small, was imbued with memory, with the stories of triumph and tragedy that had defined generations. In preserving these remnants, the survivors ensured that Troy, though physically destroyed, would endure through narrative, lineage, and the unbreakable spirit of its people. Their journey was neither easy nor swift. The plains around Troy, once fields of prosperity and trade, were now littered with bodies, broken siege engines, and the detritus of war. Survivors navigated this treacherous landscape with care, carrying the young and the infirm, shielding what they could of their heritage, and moving as quietly as the wind that whispered across the empty city. Each step was measured, each decision weighed against the certainty that pursuit or misstep could mean death. Yet even in the shadow of loss, hope endured, the hope that Troy's legacy might yet continue beyond the ashes of its fall. Aeneas, guided by both foresight and divine counsel, understood the magnitude of his task. He was not merely leading a group of survivors, he was shepherding the continuation of Troy's story. The gods, who had long influenced the city's fate, now offered subtle guidance through dreams, omens, and instinct. Every river crossed, every forest navigated, and every settlement avoided was chosen with purpose, as though the hand of destiny itself pressed upon their journey. The survival of Troy's bloodline, fragile and precarious, depended on cunning, courage, and unwavering commitment to a path few could have foreseen. As they moved farther from the smouldering remains of their city, the survivors reflected silently on all that had been lost. Palaces and towers, once monuments of strength and culture, had fallen in flames. Temples and shrines, centers of devotion and divine connection, were now reduced to ash. Families had been torn apart, and countless lives had been claimed by the fury of war. Yet in that reflection, they also recognized the endurance of the human spirit. Troy, though destroyed, had instilled in its people a capacity for resilience, courage, and the hope that even tragedy could birth new beginnings. Along the journey, Aeneas and his companions encountered landscapes both harsh and sustaining. Rivers offered water and refuge. Forests provided concealment from those who might hunt them. Hills and ridges became vantage points from which to survey and plan. The natural world, indifferent yet sustaining, became their ally as much as any strategy or weapon. With each day, the survivors honed the skills required to endure exile, balancing caution with necessity, vigilance with trust, and the weight of memory with the demands of survival. Stories of Troy, carried in the hearts and words of those who fled, became as vital as food or shelter. Elders recounted the history of kings, warriors, and heroes, passing on lessons learned in triumph and loss alike. They spoke of Hector's courage, Priam's leadership, Paris's fateful choices, and the cunning of Odysseus. These stories were more than remembrance. They were a lifeline, connecting the survivors to a past that had been nearly extinguished, ensuring that the essence of Troy would not vanish even as its walls crumbled. Through mountains, forests, and plains, the survivors pressed onward. Aeneas' leadership was both practical and symbolic. He carried the authority of the Old Kingdom, tempered by humility and grief, guiding the group with foresight, patience, and a relentless sense of duty. Every decision, from choosing a route to rationing supplies, reinforced the fragile chain that linked the remnants of Troy to the future. This journey was not merely a flight from destruction. It was a pilgrimage of survival, culture, and destiny intertwined. In exile, new foundations began to take shape. The survivors, carrying fragments of Troy's identity, would eventually establish settlements that bore the memory of their lost city. These new communities, though geographically distant, preserved the customs, rituals, and ideals of Troy. Language, law, and tradition flowed into new forms, ensuring that the lessons and legacies of Troy persisted, not only as stories in song, but as living, evolving civilizations. In this way, the ashes of Troy became fertile ground for the continuation of culture, ambition, and human ingenuity. Aeneas, burdened yet unbowed, remained a symbol of this enduring spirit. His devotion to duty, his respect for divine guidance, and his commitment to the survival of his people reflected the core values that had long sustained Troy. The journey was arduous, the path uncertain, and the obstacles many, yet his resolve never faltered. Through leadership, courage, and adherence to prophecy, he became the vessel through which Troy's essence would transcend its physical destruction. Though Troy was gone, its spirit endured in those who survived, carrying the weight of memory, loss, and hope. Each step away from the ruins was an act of defiance against oblivion, a testament to resilience, and a promise that the city's bloodline would continue. The survivors of Troy, guided by Aeneas, preserved not only life but legacy, ensuring that even amid ruin, the story of their people would persist across generations. In this exile, Troy found an afterlife not of walls and stone, but of memory, lineage, and enduring human spirit. From the ashes of a city consumed by fire, from the ruins left by strategy, deceit, and destiny, emerged the seeds of future civilizations. The courage, sacrifice, and endurance of the survivors became the foundation upon which new histories would be built. Troy, though physically destroyed, had achieved a form of immortality through its people, stories, and the unbroken chain of its bloodline. The morning light, falling upon scattered survivors and ruined streets, became a symbol of both tragedy and potential. Troy had been struck down by the convergence of human ambition, divine will, and the inexorable march of fate. Yet in the hands of the living, it had been reborn. Aeneas and his companions carried not only the remnants of a kingdom, but the enduring truth that even in the darkest hours, resilience, courage, and devotion to legacy can preserve the spirit of a civilization beyond its physical end. Thus, from the ashes of Troy, life continued. The city's walls may have fallen, its towers burned, and its people scattered, but its bloodline, its stories, and its spirit endured. Through the survivors, guided by prophecy and the wisdom of the few who remained, Troy's legacy was preserved. The city's destruction became the birthplace of memory, and from ruin, the seeds of new civilizations began to grow, a testament to the enduring resilience of humanity, even in the face of destiny's most unforgiving hand. Chapter 15. The Legend That Outlived the City. Long after the fires had consumed Troy, after the ashes had cooled, and the last cries of its defenders faded into memory, the city refused to vanish from the human imagination. Its stones, once towering and defiant, had been buried beneath centuries of soil, rain, and the passage of time. Yet Troy endured, not as walls or towers, not as streets or gates, but in story, song, and remembrance. Poets sang of its heroes, historians recorded its deeds, and travelers whispered of its grandeur and tragedy. Across generations, the city's fall became a vessel for the human fascination with courage, pride, and the inexorable force of destiny. The epics, perhaps most famously preserved in Homer's verses, transformed Troy from a physical place into a symbol. Its walls, once real, became metaphors for resilience. Its heroes, larger than life, embodied the virtues and flaws of humanity. Its downfall, orchestrated through both human action and divine design, became an eternal lesson. Hector, noble and steadfast, represented honor amid chaos. Priam, grieving yet dignified, revealed the human capacity for courage, even in the face of ultimate loss. Paris, whose choices had set the wheels of destruction in motion, reminded generations that desire and folly often intersect with destiny in ways beyond mortal control. Through centuries, storytellers embellished, reshaped, and immortalized these events. In some versions, Helen's beauty was cast as a divine instrument, her agency diminished or magnified depending on the teller's purpose. In others, the cunning of Odysseus became a template for human intelligence overcoming brute force, a lesson in the subtlety of strategy. Troy, though physically gone, became a canvas upon which successive generations painted their interpretations of loyalty, betrayal, love, ambition, and fate. Its story was no longer confined to the plain of the Aegean. It spread across the Mediterranean, across languages, across time. Yet the city's reality, buried beneath layers of earth and sediment, remained silent for centuries. The physical Troy, hidden beneath hills and forgotten by the living, awaited rediscovery. Archaeologists and historians, guided by fragments of ancient texts and the lure of legend, began to uncover what had been thought myth alone. Excavations revealed walls, foundations, and artifacts that confirmed the existence of a city that had once stood as a beacon of trade, power, and culture. The stones, though silent, told a story as vivid as any epic, of fortifications raised against invaders, of homes and temples constructed in devotion, of a civilization vibrant and enduring until the night of its destruction. The convergence of myth and archaeology transformed the story of Troy from mere legend into a bridge between imagination and reality. Scholars trace the echoes of prophecy, ambition, and strategy embedded in the city's ruins. The layers of fire and rubble were read as evidence of the final night when human error, cunning, and destiny intersected. Troy, in death, became a lens through which the world could examine both the fragility and resilience of civilization, the ways in which culture, ambition, and morality intertwine, shaping both triumph and tragedy. Travelers who came to the site centuries later walked among the remnants with awe and reflection. The plain where Greek and Trojan forces once clashed was no longer a battlefield, but a monument to history's lessons. Every fragment of wall, every buried artifact, every echo of the city's layout became a reminder that human ambition, ingenuity, and folly are timeless forces. Troy had fallen, but the forces that shaped its fate, the pride, courage, deceit, and destiny of its people, remained etched in memory, waiting for those willing to listen. The tale of Troy transcended the boundaries of time not only through scholarship, but also through oral tradition. Across civilizations, storytellers preserved the city's legacy, passing it from parent to child, from teacher to student, from bard to audience. The story became a mirror reflecting humanity's oldest struggles, the tension between desire and duty, the fragile balance of trust and deception, the relentless consequences of pride, and the inevitability of destiny. Troy's fall was not merely a historical event. It was a moral and cultural narrative, capable of shaping thought and inspiring reflection for millennia. Through myth, the city attained immortality. Its heroes, though mortal, became archetypes. Its tragedies became cautionary tales. Its triumphs, fleeting as they were, became symbols of endurance and resilience. Troy, though physically destroyed, existed perpetually in the collective consciousness, a place where memory, legend, and history converged. Each telling of the tale, whether in song, poem, or scholarly study, rekindled the spirit of the city, breathing life into stone, fire, and shadow long after the last wall had fallen. The interplay of archaeology and narrative revealed the dual nature of Troy, the tangible and the symbolic. Excavations showed the city's true scale, its complexity, and its sophistication, while epics and oral histories revealed the moral, emotional, and psychological dimensions of its story. Together, these threads wove a tapestry in which Troy was both a real place of human endeavor and a symbol of the eternal human condition. Loss, courage, ambition, folly, and resilience were embedded in its stones and immortalized in its legends. Through this convergence, Troy became more than a city. It became a lens through which humanity could examine itself. The choices of its leaders, the valor of its defenders, and the mistakes that led to its fall offered lessons still relevant today. That pride and desire can blind even the vigilant. That cunning and patience can shape outcomes more decisively than force. And that civilization, no matter how grand, is fragile when destiny and human ambition collide. The story endured because it reflected truths larger than Troy itself, truths about the human heart, the nature of conflict, and the inevitability of fate. Even now, when tourists and scholars walk among the ruins, when poets recount the deeds of Hector, Priam, and Aeneas, Troy continues to live. Its fall is a warning, its survival in memory a triumph. The city's story, etched in fire, blood, and heroism, outlived its walls, its temples, and its towers. The legend, shaped by song, scholarship, and excavation, became a timeless reflection on the vulnerability and resilience of humanity. Troy endures not as a city of stone, but as a city of story, a testament to the ways in which memory, myth, and history intertwine to preserve the essence of civilization. Through centuries of retelling, Troy teaches that cities may fall, kingdoms may crumble, and lives may be lost, but the human capacity to remember, to narrate, and to learn from the past endures. The stones buried beneath the earth, the artifacts uncovered by patient hands, and the epic verses sung across generations all converge to keep Troy alive. Its story remains a mirror of human aspiration and fragility, a narrative in which every listener finds echoes of courage, folly, and destiny. Troy, once consumed by fire and betrayed by fate, remains immortal in its story. It is a testament to the endurance of culture and memory, a reflection of humanity's oldest struggles, and a reminder that even in ruin, civilization can inspire awe and reflection. The city may have fallen, but its legend lives on, outlasting time, conquest, and mortality itself, echoing eternally across the generations. Troy's story does not end with the collapse of its walls, nor with the fall of its kings, nor even with the fires that consumed its streets. Its end was merely a beginning, a transformation from a physical city into a symbol, a reflection of human ambition, frailty, and the inexorable hand of destiny. The stones, once arranged with care and labor, may have crumbled, yet the memory of Troy refuses to vanish. It endures in song, in story, and in the discoveries of those who dare to unearth the past. What remains of Troy is not merely a ruin, but a mirror, showing humanity the delicate tension between fate and choice, between pride and prudence, and between desire and consequence. From the earliest chronicles to the verses of Homer, the tale of Troy has been shaped by memory and imagination. Heroes and kings, warriors and citizens, all exist now both in historical conjecture and in mythic resonance. Hector's steadfast courage, Priam's mournful dignity, Aeneas' devotion to duty, Paris' fateful desires, and Helen's beauty and influence. These figures transcend their mortal lives to become timeless exemplars of virtue, flaw, and consequence. The city's destruction was a culmination of forces beyond a single lifetime: human ambition, divine will, and the delicate fragility of fortune. Yet it is precisely these forces that render Troy unforgettable. Archaeology, centuries later, confirmed the truth behind the stories. Buried beneath layers of earth, Troy's foundations revealed a city of remarkable sophistication. Fortifications built with strategic precision, homes and palaces designed for both grandeur and defense, and artifacts reflecting a civilization steeped in trade, culture, and religion. Each unearthed relic, each fragment of pottery or wall was a whisper from the past, speaking across millennia to those willing to listen. Troy's reality and its legend converged in these discoveries, affirming that what the world remembered in song had a basis in lived history. The city that was consumed by fire still speaks, even in silence, to the resilience of human achievement and the fragility that shadows it. Yet Troy endures not only through evidence and epics, but in the moral and emotional resonance of its story. Its fall reminds us that even the strongest cities, like the strongest people, are vulnerable to pride and desire, to deception and misjudgment. The city's citizens, from kings to commoners, had lived under a prophecy that warned of ruin, yet hope and human longing often outweighed caution. The Greeks' cunning and Odysseus' strategy, combined with Troy's own desire to believe in respite and peace, transformed hope into vulnerability. The lesson is subtle, yet enduring. Vigilance and humility are as crucial to survival as courage and strength. From the ashes of Troy, new life emerged, not merely in the literal sense of survivors carrying the bloodline to distant lands, but in the enduring power of story itself. Aeneas and his companions, guided by destiny, carried Troy's legacy across seas and generations, seeding future civilizations with the memory of a fallen city. And for those who never traveled beyond the Aegean, Troy persisted through song, history, and memory, a testament to the enduring human need to remember, to reflect, and to learn. In its destruction lay a paradox. Ruin became revelation, loss became instruction, and memory became stronger than stone. The imagery of Troy, the towering walls, the smoking ruins, the chaos of battle and fire, resonates across time because it reflects universal human experiences. Cities, like nations and empires, rise and fall under the pressures of ambition, desire, and circumstance. Troy's fate was shaped by choices made under duress, yet also by forces beyond mortal control, divine will, prophecy, and the unrelenting currents of history. Its story bridges the gap between human agency and cosmic design, demonstrating that even the smallest decisions can reverberate across generations, influencing outcomes far beyond their immediate scope. In reflecting on Troy, we are also invited to reflect upon ourselves. What we build, we may see crumble. What we protect, we may see lost. Yet the stories we tell, the lessons we preserve, and the legacies we shape endure far beyond our lifetimes. Troy's fall is a caution and a reminder. Greatness does not guarantee permanence, and survival is as much about wisdom as it is about strength. Its story challenges us to consider the balance between action and foresight, desire and restraint, hope and vigilance. The city's legendary fall, immortalized in fire and blood, continues to inspire artists, writers, historians, and scholars. Every retelling brings new insight, reminding each generation that Troy is not merely a city of the past, but a living symbol of human experience. Its ruins, though silent, speak to the enduring nature of civilization, and its stories, though centuries old, echo the timeless struggles of humanity. Through Troy, we see the patterns of ambition, the consequences of hubris, and the enduring potential of resilience and legacy. Even today, when the plain of Troy is visited, when ruins are examined, when epics are read aloud, the city breathes through memory. Its walls may have fallen, its towers may have burned, and its kings and warriors may have perished, yet Troy persists as a living chronicle. The lessons of its rise and fall remain vivid. Vigilance against deception, respect for the forces beyond our control, and the recognition that the choices of individuals can shape the destiny of nations. Troy teaches that history is not merely a sequence of events, but a dialogue between action, consequence, and memory. Ultimately, Troy endures because human beings will not allow it to be forgotten. It endures because we are drawn to stories of heroism and tragedy, because we seek meaning in the rise and fall of civilizations, and because we are compelled to reflect on the interplay between fate and free will. Troy's story is eternal, not because of its walls or armies, but because of the truths it embodies. That ambition can blind, that courage can inspire, that loss can instruct, and that memory can outlast even the most devastating destruction. The city may have perished in flame, yet it burns still in the imagination, in scholarship, and in art. Troy's legacy reminds us that human stories, once told and preserved, are more enduring than stone, more resilient than fire, and more influential than kings or empires. From the ashes of history, from the ruins of a civilization, emerges a truth both simple and profound. The endurance of memory is the truest measure of a city's greatness. Troy teaches, above all, that even in ruin, there is revelation. The flames that once consumed its streets now illuminate the human heart, revealing patterns of ambition, courage, and folly that are as relevant today as they were in the age of kings and heroes. Its story, preserved in legend and excavation, is a mirror in which humanity sees itself, fragile, ambitious, resilient, and endlessly capable of both creation and destruction. And so the legend of Troy endures. Its walls may be dust, its kings may rest in forgotten grave, and its fires may have long since died, but its memory burns brighter than stone. Through epic verse, through archaeological discovery, through reflection and retelling, Troy persists. It endures not merely as history, but as a symbol, a city of lessons, a city of destiny, a city whose story continues to echo, carrying the deepest truths of human experience across the centuries. Troy teaches us that destruction is never absolute, that memory can transcend mortality, and that the stories we preserve hold the power to outlast empires. In the ashes of the fallen city, we find enduring insight, that the greatest tragedies can illuminate the deepest lessons, and that conclusion, where memory burns brighter than stone history, when remembered and honored, continues to shape the world long after the last flames fade.